In this week's episode of Fix the Photo, we're going to look at some of our members' entries into the topic of glass in the weekly challenge. And I've selected two images to do a little bit of work on. We've got this image by Quentin Arrault and this image by Slavek Sekanina. Both very nice images, but I feel we can do a few little tweaks to improve them. The first image by Quentin, very, very simple. Let me just run through what I've done to improve it. Here we have before and after. It was just simply a case of increasing contrast in the central area, and only in the central area because we don't want to add additional contrast in the areas that aren't important. It's just to bring a little bit more attention to the product. Let me run through exactly what was done. So first of all, a little bit of a curves adjustment overall on the bottle area. A little bit of hue saturation, a bit of dodging work to sort out that darker shadow on the side. The burn layer wasn't used. And then you can see the layer mask on the group, which I'll bring up here to show you, then only allowed all of that work to happen to the central area only. So if I turn that layer mask off, you see that would have darkened out the corners and other parts of the image as well. But by using the layer mask on the group, then we retain it just to the area of the bottle. So fairly straightforward on that one. The next one, again, mostly contrast adjustments that are really needed here. It's got a lovely sort of softness to it for a glass image on this particular image by Slavek, but I feel it could play around with the contrast a little bit more. So I'm going to go in two directions with this. First of all, I'm going to have some higher contrast areas, and then second of all, some lower contrast areas. So let's make a couple of adjustment layers, one and another one. And on the first contrast adjustment layer, I'm going to darken in, pull in the shadow end to darken that up a little bit. I'm just going to look at the highlight end, possibly a tiny bit there, and then I'm going to invert that mask so we don't see that. And then on the other contrast adjustment, I'm going to lower the contrast. So I'm going to take the shadow end up and take the highlight end down a little bit, and then I'm going to invert that mask as well. So we're now back to as the image was, and now with a paintbrush, let's use my Wacom for this. With a very soft paintbrush with white paint on the higher contrast layer, good idea to label your layers. So let's call this HC for high contrast, and we'll call this one LC for lower contrast. So on the higher contrast layer, I'm just going to use my brush and I'm just going to start painting in. I'm going to drop the opacity of the brush a little bit so that I'm not using the full opacity in one go as I work this in. And I'm just going to take areas that I think might benefit from the higher contrast, and that's the areas with a bit of color and a little bit of clarity, or where they could benefit from a little bit of punch. Now, in seeing that, I've looked at that yellow one there, and I don't think that yellow one does benefit. So I flick back to black paint, and I'll paint that back again, go back to the lower contrast option there. Back to white paint, maybe I'll increase the contrast on the reflections a little bit on these two as well. Then these on that edge, they look like they could do with a little bit more contrast down that side there. Now you can choose, obviously, wherever you want to add your contrast, higher or lower. So let me flick that on and off. So that's what it was. That's what I've done with a little bit of increased contrast. Now you could say, well, actually, I'd like to add more contrast down here, if you wanted, of course, but I don't really want to do that. In fact, what I want to do is decontrast some of the other areas so that those two bottles at the front stand out a little bit more. Now actually that decontrasting I've just done there isn't going to the right level because the highlight end has been pulled down too far. It's really more the mid-tone. Let me just get that on there. That's more like it, so it's more of a softer contrast. That's probably still a bit too much, so let's get that to about the right level. Let's just flick it on and off. So I'm just going to pull the mid-tones up a little bit on that contrast curve. Okay, then let's go back to the mask, and then it's things like that stem running in from the top. There's a little bit high contrast, taking us out the shot a little bit. And then any other areas where you feel, oh, actually it could benefit from being just a bit reduced in contrast. I mean, it didn't necessarily need to be anywhere in particular, but it just gives you the idea that if you want to reduce contrast in some areas and increase it in others, then very easy to do by just simply utilizing a couple of layer masks set at different contrast levels. Now let's just look at the two layers on and off. So we've gone from that to that, and we can play around with the levels of each one quite easily by adjusting the opacity of that particular layer if we want to. And again, with the low contrast one, we can adjust the opacity of the layer if we want to as well. So you can see that reduction in contrast on the back items, but if you think you've taken it too far, then you can just bring it back partially. Now, I mentioned about this mixing stick sticking up out the top of that particular jar, and that being a little bit strong in contrast and potentially leading us out the shot. It's a very simple way to deal with that. Let's just add a new layer, and I'm going to sample the color just here to the side of that stick, and then with a very low opacity brush, 10-14% there, just start to paint over it and just basically just put a very gentle wash down, and I can resample the color again nearby. And then all you're doing is you're just feathering it out a little bit so that it's less obvious, a lower contrast item, not taking you out the shot too much. And again, if you've done it too much, if it's on a new layer, just tweak the opacity slightly as you see fit. And then remember, with the adjustment layers, in terms of the contrast that you've applied, you can always go in and tweak the contrast levels to a greater degree if you feel necessary. So that's the great beauty of working with contrast adjustment layers, is you've got full control over how much or how little you want to apply. Let's take all of those layers, put them in a new folder, and then let's just look at before and after. So that was the shot before, which was very nice, but just a little bit flat and weak for me, and then just boosted it up in certain areas using a couple of contrast layers and a little bit of paintwork. Well, hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like to enter any of our weekly challenges, our critique shows, or our briefs, then head over to karltayloreducation.com. Thanks very much for watching.